Going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this discussion of Robert Chao Romero's book, Brown Church, 5 Centuries of Latina Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity, which was recently published by InterVarsity Press. We are grateful to the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, who organized this event, and the Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies, who are its co-sponsor. I'm your moderator, Genevieve Carpio, an assistant professor in Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce our author, Robert Chao Romero, an associate professor in the departments of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies and Asian American Studies. He received his PhD from UCLA in Latin American history and his Juris Doctor from UC Berkeley, and is also an attorney. He has an impressive list of publications. He is the author of Brown Church, which was written with the support of a Louisville Institute sabbatical grant for researchers, Jesus for Revolutionaries, An Introduction to Race, Social Justice, and Christianity, and Mixed Race Student Politics. He's also the author of The Chinese in Mexico, which received the Latina Latino Studies Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association. Professor Romero is an ordained minister and faith-rooted community organizer. In just a moment, he'll be sharing a short talk about Brown Church, its arguments and interventions. As a reminder, as I had in the opening slide, you may use the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen to pose a question to our author at any time. At the end of the talk, we're going to pull from these questions for a conversation with Professor Romero. You can also engage us via social media. Throughout this event, we encourage you to use hashtag Brown Church and to tag at UCLA_CSRC on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. So again, that's hashtag Brown Church. We are also joined by 3 panelists who will share reflections on the text and kick us off in a public conversation with the author. Marisol Sánchez Castillo is a doctoral student at UCLA in the School of Education and Information Studies. Her research centers on higher education, policy and practice, focusing on campus racial climate as it pertains to Latino students and undocumented students. Marisol received 2 Bachelor of Arts in Mexican American Studies and Spanish and a Master's in Educational Leadership and Policy from the University of Texas at Austin. She has extensive professional work experience in the K-16 education pipeline, serving historically underserved communities in the US and abroad. We will next be joined by Daniel Solórzano, a professor of social science and comparative education and Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. He is also the inaugural director of the UCLA Center for Critical Race Studies in Education. His teaching and research interests include critical race theory in education, racial microaggressions, racial microaffirmations, and critical race spatial analysis. Dr. Solórzano has authored more than 100 research articles, book chapters, and books on issues related to educational access and equity for underrepresented student populations and community in the US. He's the recipient of an impressive array of awards, some of which include the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, the American Education Research Association Social Justice in Education Award, the Critical Race Studies in Education Association Derek A. Bell Legacy Award, the inaugural Revolutionary Mentor Award from the AERA Critical Educators for Social Justice, and most recently, the Distinguished Alumni Award from the Claremont Graduate University, and the 50th Anniversary Distinguished Alumni Award from the Chicano Latino Studies Affairs Center at the Claremont Colleges. Solórzano has also been elected to the National Academy of Education as a fellow of the American Education Research Association. Following Dr. Solórzano's comments, we'll be joined by Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black, who is a professor of art history and Chicana, Chicano Studies at UCLA, associate director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, editor of Aslan, a journal of Chicano Studies, and founding editor-in-chief of Latin American and Latinx visual culture. She publishes on a range of topics related to Chicana studies, contemporary Latinx art, and the modern Iberian world. Her most recent books include Renaissance Futurities, Art, Science, Invention, Knowledge for Justice, an Ethnic Studies Reader, and the new 2020 edition of the Chicano Studies Reader, which she co-edited. Her monograph, Transforming Saints, Women, Art, and Conversion in Spain and New Spain, is under contract with Vanderbilt University Press, as is her co-edited volume, Decolonizing Art History, to be published by Routledge. She's currently finalizing a book for the CSRC Chicano archival series titled The Artist is Eyewitness, Antonio Bernal Papers, 1884 to 2019. So it's a very impressive collection of panelists today. We will begin with a presentation by Robert Chao Romero, followed by panelist comments and a Q&A. I'd like now to welcome Robert Chao Romero to share his presentation.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for that just very personal introduction, and hearing about you and Professor Solórzano, Danny, and Charlene, and Marisol. Like, I'm reminded of how blessed I am at UCLA, the most amazing colleagues of the universe. And thank you all for, Jenna, for helping to organize this. It means so much to me, and for Danny and Charlene for taking of your precious time. You're all amazing scholars. I look up to you. And thank you, Marisol, also for being here to be able to share a student perspective. And thank you, CSRC, and Sean and Rebecca and others for all of your support. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen and to put up some slides. Let's see here. I might be having a little bit of difficulty. It's not letting me share. I'm sorry. I know we tested it before. Huh. I'm not sure. Oh gosh.
Oh, it should be good to go now.
Should we go? Okay. There we go. Great. I had a little bit of technical difficulties before. I was scrambling, but thankfully it is working. Andale pues, we got it, right? Okay. Good. This morning, I was feeling pretty nervous. I still am, honestly, because of the way this talk brings together so many different parts of my life. Brings together my Chicanx scholarship. It brings together sort of my passion for theology, my pastoral background, CRT, so many things, and typically so many things that don't usually come together, at least in the academic setting. So I was pretty nervous this morning, and I went on a walk in my neighborhood, up and down the block. I was listening to Mana, to the MTV album of Mana, and someone called me OG the other day, and I think that Mana fits with the OG from back in the 90s. But I was listening, and I'm thinking, what am I going to share as I come today to this very important talk? And I started to think about my abuelita, and I started to think about my time growing up in the Latino church as a kid. I went to a church called El Salvador, Iglesia Bautista, known more affectionately to my family as El Sal. And it was there that I learned from my abuelita about theology, about God. Latino theology has this framework of abuelita theology, and it refers to the fact that in many of our Latino families, we don't have 3 years and $60,000 to go get a Master's of Divinity degree. So what happens is that a lot of times our abuelas, our moms, our tias become our functional pastors or functional priests of our family, right? And they teach us about God. And there's many examples of that in Latino history. So I just thought of my abuelita's legacy. I thought of the church. I remembered how when we were kids, you had families from Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, El Salvador, all over the place, coming from so many different parts of of just the hemisphere, and together becoming family, right? And developing this identity that, okay, we're here, we're all kind of the kids of immigrants, and let's make life happen together. And I thought also about how at El Sal, it was a place of dignity for many people who were not treated with dignity in the other aspects of their life, right? They might have been like factory workers, or they might have been, worked as in landscaping, or they worked at a booth selling parking tickets. But in the church, they were hermano, hermana, they were deacon, they were elder, they were even sometimes pastor, right? And I saw all these memories came flooding back to me. I remembered also of like how at Christmas time, we'd go to the church, like I have like 9 uncles and aunts on my dad's side. We'd flood the church, right? Dozens of cousins. We'd go to my abuelita's house, pack it into this little tiny house, eating tamales and wishing that we were eating ham. Now I appreciate the tamales, but back then we're like, why can't we just have ham and potatoes like everybody else, right? And I remember getting the little apple when you'd leave the church. They give you an apple. I remember like on Mother's Day too, where we would invite all my uncles and aunts and cousins, dozens of us would show up on Mother's Day at the church, because whoever had the most family members present, whatever mom had the most family members present, they get a bouquet of flowers. So we'd flood the church, right? And all of these, as I was thinking about these memories, I started to cry, actually, like from a deep place inside of me. I even came home and I was like telling Erica, and I was trying to figure out what's that deep place that is resonating here. And I think that what was resonating was the unspoken, the sacred. What I experienced growing up in El Sal and in my family with respect to religion, it was sacred, sagrada, right? I didn't have the words for it. I still don't know if I have the words for it, but it was sacred. My church growing up, it was not perfect by any means. I can tell lots of stories, but it was a repository, a vehicle of community cultural wealth, as Torreyoso talks about. And all the types of community cultural wealth that Torreyoso mentions were present and shared in that church space. The aspirational cultural capital, the linguistic capital, the familial capital, the social capital, navigational capital, resistance capital, and as Lindsay Perez Uber expands, spiritual capital that ran through all of that. And that was what made me cry. There was something there that was sacred. Then I went off to college, and that was the first time where I was exposed to this idea that Christianity is only simply a racist, classist, and sexist religion. Now, I know that there's so much bad, horrible, even evil things that have been done in church history, and that's horrible, and I totally recognize that. And it's just, but that being said, the presentation of Christianity was only that stuff, and not the community cultural wealth that I knew, right? In the classes that I took, Abuelita theology was just superstition. It was superstition. There was, if you will, Abuelita epistemicide, right? All of this community cultural wealth that I inherited through the church, through my family, through immigrant families, that was not a valid source of knowledge, right? And there was honestly like a lot of disrespect of the Latino church, whether Protestant or Catholic. And it was very much a binary. It was like, if either you want to be down with La Causa, and if you want to be down with La Causa, then Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic, it stands totally opposed. They cannot go with one another. It was very much a binary, right? And I found that myself and many others live in what you might call the Christian activist borderlands, where in activist circles and ethnic studies, we're told Christianity is just not, it's not compatible. It's against justice, right? And on the other hand, in many of our churches as well, we're told, well, justice doesn't go there, doesn't fit there either, right? That's like sort of liberalism or something. And so many of us, I think millions of us in the United States today are kind of stuck in between, in the borderlands, you know, to use the framework from Gloria Anzaldúa. I think that as Chicanx studies and Latinx studies clings to this binary, I think there are some pretty damaging results, unhealthy results. There's psychological damage that students experience. I met a student who had this experience, and she was seeing a psychiatrist because she was going through like really deep depression because she didn't know how to reconcile those two worlds, right? The abuelita theology with what she was learning in school. There is oftentimes a disrespect of that sacred, right? All the things that I talked about, those stories that were sacred, and that can turn into like a hostile campus climate quite frequently. You know, when faced with that choice, okay, am I going to choose my abuelita or am I going to choose Chicanx studies? Many students say, fine, I'm going to choose my abuela. I'm not going to join Chicanx studies, Latinx studies. And so we lose so many students because of that binary. We also experience a research and a curricular gap in Chicanx, Latinx studies, where Latino community and religion is just like, there's hardly any of it because it's too just dangerous almost. It's too sensitive to explore this topic. And this is a serious claim here, but there's epistemicide. It's a very strong claim, but I think it's true. Where Latino theologies and communal spiritualities are not seen as valid sources of knowledge, right? That's very strong, I know, but it's true for a lot of different reasons. You know, of 60 million Latinos roughly in the United States today, 83% claim a religious affiliation, 55% Catholic, 22% Protestant, 3% other, 18% unaffiliated, and 1% other. So we are a very religious community by any explanation, and yet there's hardly any research on the role of religion in Chicano Latino communities. As Mario Garcia said from UCSB, despite the fact that the vast majority of US Latinos claim to be religious or spiritual, little has been written on Mexican-American Chicano or Chicano religions from a multidisciplinary perspective. There's very little interaction among and between Chicanx studies, Latinx studies, religious studies, Latinx theology, and liberation theology. And that's a long history there, too long to go into, but there's very little in any direction. I heard this interesting statistic talking to someone that in all the Chicano studies and Latino studies departments in the country, I don't know of a single professor that was hired as a religion scholar. Not a single one where, like, in other words, like a department said, okay, here's our department. We have these certain gaps. Let's devote an entire FTE, an entire professional professor line to someone that does religion. Some of us, like me, we kind of like come in through the side, right? Or we kind of just like, but that's really telling, right? Jacqueline Hidalgo is one of the few that has kind of brought together ethnic studies and biblical studies. And there are also, you know, again, other notable exceptions beyond the ones I just mentioned, like Gaston Espinosa, David Carrasco, Elisa Facio, and others, right? Dr. Villaseñor Black and others. But for the most part, like, it's kind of taboo to kind of look at religion. My book and this talk, I want to present the idea that the brown church can be a puente, can be a bridge between Chicanx studies, Latinx studies, theology, and religious studies. This is how I define brown church. A prophetic ecclesial community of Latinas and Latinos, both Catholic and Protestant, that has contested racial and social injustice in Latin America and the United States for 5 centuries. As such, brown church is a multivalent category, encompassing ethnic, historical, theological, spiritual, and socio-political dimensions. In every instance of racial and social injustice in Latin America and the United States over the centuries, the brown church has arisen to challenge the religious, socio-economic, and political status quo. Collectively, the brown church has challenged the Spanish conquest, colonialism, the sistema de castas, manifest destiny, US settler colonialism in the Southwest, Latin American dictatorships, US imperialism in Central America, the oppression of farm workers, and the current exploitation of undocumented immigrants. The brown church has not been perfect, but the brown church has been there in a way that I think has not been looked at with much nuance. Again, not perfect, but there in a powerful way. And here you see some images of people who are part of, in my view, the brown church, like Sor Juana Inés, right? Cesar Chavez, Las Casas, Oscar Romero, and there's many, many others, right? As we have been the brown church, we have also studied the biblical scriptures and developed a unique body of social justice theology. And for many people in the faith community, it's kind of trendy now, like, well, I'm going to study justice in the Bible, right? Like, or there's these conferences like, oh yeah, pack it in, 1,000 people to hear from some 40-year-old white guy about justice in the Bible. I'm just being real, right? But as the brown church, we've been developing social justice theology for 500 years. 500 years. And so our theology embodies 5 centuries of Latino spiritual capital and community cultural wealth. It represents, largely in Chicano studies, an untapped knowledge system. To talk briefly about brown, the way I use brown in the book is that brown is symbolic of the cultural and biological mestizaje of Latin America. I'm not talking about in a political sense, but just the fact that as Latinos and Latinas, we come in all shades and every mixture, right? We're Asian Latinos, we're Afro-Latinos, we're indigenous Latinos, we're mestizos, we're Jewish, we're Armenian, like that's what I mean by brown, that mixture. And brown also as a symbol of the racial liminality that we experience as Latinos in the US, as sort of positioned in between white and black, legally, historically, socially, and so forth, right? And from that space of in between, we have been church. I wrote a poem inspired by I Am Joaquin, the famous Chicano poem of the 60s, to capture this idea of the brown church. And I think that this poem shares what I'm trying to communicate perhaps better than just in any kind of theoretical language. I am the brown church. God calls me mija, mijo. Brown, black, white, even yellow are all within me. When black and white come to talk, my voice is not heard. I am not invited to the table. I share much with my black sisters and brothers, yet my voice is distinct. I long, I cry out to be heard for who I am, the brown church. Yo soy Montesinos gritando in 1511, the conquest is opposed to Christ. Y Bartolomé de las Casas, whose eyes like Moses were open to the suffering of his people and never look back. Yo soy Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. My heart burns for the treasures of wisdom which are hidden in Christ. Though machismo assails me, aunque está bloqueado el camino, I do not relent. Yo soy Catarina de San Juan, la China Poblana. Stolen from Asia, enslaved by Spanish masters, I find freedom as the bride of Christ. I too hold the keys of the kingdom. Yo soy Padre Antonio Martínez de Nuevo Mexico. Aunque robaron a Aslan, I know no nation holds a manifest destiny to decimate the people of another, also beloved of God. In the time of Jim Crow, they called me wetback, beaner, spick, and sent me to Mexican schools. Yet I am Mendez, Bernal, Perales, Galleros. My children are not cows. You cannot place them in a barn. My children are not animals. You cannot keep them in a cage. Yo soy Mamaleo y Santos Elizondo, mujeres forged in tongues of fire. Nadie me detendrá porque el Espíritu del Señor está sobre mí. I am Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. I was raised in the bosom of Abuelita theology and know that the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of God. Unos años después, mis primos huyeron la tierra madre, the land of the Savior, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Centroamérica, Argentina, Perú, Bolivia, Brasil y el resto de Sudamérica. Empujada por el huracán de violencia, guerrillas, Reagan, priest, all vied for me, yet on Christ my eyes were fixed. I am also Gutiérrez, Boff y Romero, y yo sé que el reino de Dios trae liberación y que el Espíritu nos libera. Como protestantes, we also protested porque la ropa anglosajón strangled la buena nueva. Soy Padilla y Escobar, recobrando la misión integral del Señor. Yo soy los dos alas del mismo pájaro, puertorriqueño, nuyorican, cubano y dominicano también. Though the colonizers have changed, the cries of Las Casas still ring strong in my ears. I am a dreamer, indocumentado, sin papeles. No human being is illegal. Jesús es mi refugio. I am a child of God. I now seek my voice, thoughts of God my own. I also am among the 12. God calls me mija, mijo. I am the brown church. I know our time has quickly gone by, and there's many more things that I could say, but in the book, I also provide an overview of 500 years of brown theology that you can dig into: Protestant, Catholic, Pentecostal, liberationist, mujerista. And so I would encourage to further pursue that. So I think through the poem, through what I've shared, I think I've presented my major argument. I will close by saying that brown church is also a social identity. Just as the term Chicano became a new social identity in the 1960s for those who were longing for a social identity that captured the cultural heritage, the full cultural heritage of those of Mexican-American descent. And just like the Chicano original social identity provided a platform of social identity for politics and justice work, brown church, brown Christianity is also a social identity. And one of the biggest joys that I've had over the last 2.5 months that the book has been out has been to receive messages from people all over the country, even in Latin America. It's the most amazing thing, right? And here's one note that I'll close with that I think shows this aspect of brown church as social identity for those who find themselves in that borderlands. This Latino graduate student said, "I cried all night, but I finally found a home." What's amazing is that this home has been there this whole time. I woke up feeling so proud of being who God created me to be in such a time as this. So thank you for listening, for that presentation, and I look forward to conversation and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Romero. I can see in the chat that resonated really powerfully with those in the room. So now we're going to go ahead and welcome our panelists to share their comments and reactions. Before making that transition, I do want to remind you that you can put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. We really encourage that for the discussion that we'll have at the end of the panel. I also want to encourage you to use the hashtags Brown Church on social media and to tag the CSRC. Their handle is at UCLA_CSRC. There will be a raffle with copies of Brown Church for those who use the hashtag, and we will be contacting you via the social media handles that you use. So lots of great incentive to share what you're hearing today. So it is my pleasure to first welcome Marisol Sánchez Castillo, who will kick us off in our discussion.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my title page? Yes. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this book talk. This is a topic that's actually very near and dear to my heart. So I hope that I am able to transmit my enthusiasm for the book through this Zoom call. And just a little background information, I participated in a book study of the Brown Church this summer with friends in Texas. And I realized that as a Mexican American Studies major in college, I had learned much of the history of the Southwest as it pertains to Mexican Americans. But in reading Brown Church, I realized that what I didn't learn was the faith history of our communities and how it's been significant in the fight for justice. So thank you again to all of you who are joining us today, and I'll get started. So a little personal background about me. Although I did not grow up in a religious home, my parents would always say, con el favor de Dios, right, with God's favor, as a way of acknowledging our own limitations as humans, but also as a way of acknowledging the existence of God, which I consider a form of faith that was passed down to them. And as I ponder on the work that I do now as a doctoral student, I can say with full confidence that my work in equity and justice in education in particular is primarily motivated by my faith and my lived experiences as an immigrant in the US. So my personal story is that I came to this country undocumented, and it pretty much lived my entire childhood and teenage years as an undocumented immigrant. So this brings us to the book. My first reaction is how much the concept of the spiritual borderlands, or the state of living in a spiritual in-betweenness, resonated with me. Dr. Romero shared anonymous stories of the students who felt that they could not be activists for social justice and at the same time keep the faith that they were brought up or that they grew up in. And so, like the students, I used to wrestle with similar feelings, especially as I navigate faith and academia, which are two entities that we see often exclude each other. But the book reinforces for me my love for social justice and my love for my faith, but it also reinforces how social justice and faith are not mutually exclusive and can, in fact, work together. The book also gives us so many stories of how throughout the last 500 years, our communities have engaged spiritual capital. One particular example that resonated with me is the story of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was a Mexican nun. She resisted the patriarchy and religious leaders of the time to fight for women's right to have access to an education, among other things. And she used her faith and her strong knowledge of the Bible and theology to make her case for equity. So I consider the book to be a new tool to help us understand how our communities have used faith as a form of spiritual capital throughout centuries in the fight for justice. Also through the stories captured in the book, and as we pull away from Western Christianity, we see the good that has come out of people of faith. So as a result of this, I believe the Brown Church is foundational to a new Latina and Latino collective consciousness of faith and activism. So in other words, this collective consciousness can and should deconstruct a Christianity that centers and upholds Western values, which has resulted in the erasure of our own faith experiences. But also, Brown Church gives us the opportunity to bridge faith, activism, and even academia, so the three can work together as we continue to pursue justice in our communities. Okay, so moving forward as a collective, these are mis reflexiones, my reflections. And one thing I noticed is that as it pertains to scholarship, I believe the study of religion and faith is often overlooked in Chicana, Chicano, Latino studies due to the negative association between Western Christianity and injustice. In other words, we see how a colonized Christianity has been complicit in the injustices of our people in our homelands, but also in the US. And as we seek to study faith further, we must also remember that we are responsible for ensuring that this knowledge is being passed down to generations that are coming after us. Because in writing about our communities and our experiences, to forget faith is to have an incomplete story. So I would like to end with an excerpt from the book that really spoke to my heart, and I hope it also speaks to your heart as well. So this is the one I chose. As Brown Christians, we claim a social identity that encompasses our love for Jesus, our rich and diverse God-given cultural heritages, and our passion for justice and liberation. We no longer leave any of it outside the colonizer's door. In response to the question, ¿Quién soy yo?, the Brown Church responds, I am the Brown Church. Gracias.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those thoughtful comments. Professor Romero will have a chance to respond collectively at the end of the panel comments. We will next be joined by Dr. Daniel Solórzano.
Thanks, Genevieve. And thanks, Roberto, for asking me to participate on this panel. I'm gonna tell a very personal story as my reaction to the book. I've titled it My Critical Race Counter Story on the Brown Church. And you posed 3 questions to us a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to try to answer this question. And the question you posed is, how might increased scholarship on the study of religion enhance our understanding of the Chicanx, Latinx community in your respective fields of study? And so I would argue that Dr. Romero, you use the critical race tools of counter storytelling. I mean, I'll talk about that in a second. Community cultural wealth, as you mentioned, and Marisol mentioned, especially Lindsay Perez-Uber's spiritual capital, which is a more recent sort of adaptation or expansion of community cultural wealth. You talk about religious microaggressions that I really would want to talk more about, because I think this is really, really important. And I think it's an important area of research that I think we should continue. And you also talked about transformational resistance in the Brown Church, in which I think I'll be speaking most to in these comments. You begin the book, I think, with those critical race counter stories of Rosa, Carlos, and Edwin. I think that was really, really important. Hearing those stories of young men and women who experience what I guess you would argue, we would argue, are these racial microaggressions, or I'm sorry, religious microaggressions that they experience both inside and outside of academia. There are these autobiographical stories, I argue, that are really important contributions to the role of religion and spirituality in the lives of Latina and Latino students, activists, educators, and scholars. And I wish we would be able to tell more of those stories. I think this is an area of research that I think your book pushes us and encourages us. And as I'll say at the end, you give us a roadmap to achieve that. And so this is my abridged, shortened Catholic social teaching, critical race theory counter story. You argue in the book that all theology is contextual. And I would argue that it's contextual across time and place. It's the time that you're living through and the place in which you're living it. And so I grew up in LA. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I was born in 1949. I went to school, as you'll see in a second, during a really important part of history, certainly Chicana and Chicano history, during the civil rights movement. Here's my prologue to the story. During these years, from 1955 to 1975, this is when I was in school, right? This is when I attended school. From my first grade to my first master's, I went to parochial schools, Catholic schools, I started at Sacred Heart Elementary School in Lincoln Heights, which is Northeast Los Angeles or East Los Angeles. I went to Cathedral High School, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, in and around Koreatown. I went to St. Mary's College for 1 year up in Northern California, another Christian Brothers school. I went to Loyola University for my undergraduate degree in sociology and Chicano studies, or it's called at the time Mexican American studies. And then I finished at Loyola Marymount University as it changed over from Loyola University to Loyola Marymount. I was probably one of the last graduates of Loyola University. I have to tell you that my experience of those 20 years of schooling, I was influenced by the people who taught me and the values of these folks that taught me. So in my elementary years, from 1st grade to 8th grade, I was taught by the Dominican nuns, right? And the principles and the values of Dominican nuns are that they stand with the young, the poor, and the vulnerable. And so just picture yourself as a young kid, this is my experience, being taught year in and year out these stories, these important stories about how we as Catholics should stand with the young and with the poor and the vulnerable. The Christian Brothers were my teachers in high school. The Christian Brothers, their values, their principles are to live simply, teach passionately, pray deeply, and stand with the poor. And then finally, in my undergraduate years, I was trained by the Jesuits. And the Jesuit principles are, among other things, forming and educating agents of change and a preferential option for the poor. And so these three sort of teachers of mine, this is what they taught me. They taught me the importance of the preferential option for the poor and those at the social margins, right? This is what they taught me day in, day out, year in, year out. And so again, I'm being raised in this context, along with my parents, my grandparents, and my community. And it's at a time during the civil rights movement that I'm being trained in this way by these teachings of the Dominicans, the Christian Brothers, and the Jesuits. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of my experiences. My case one is from 1968, 1970. At that time, I had just finished high school. I was transitioning over to St. Mary's College and then to Loyola University. And I was involved in a movement called Católicos por la Raza. And again, this is a picture of Católicos on December 31st, 1969. This was we picketed, we marched against which is the largest archdiocese in the United States, the LA Archdiocese, Catholic Archdiocese. And we were marching because we put the church's wealth, we were challenging the church to put its wealth in service of the poor, right? In service of poor communities in Los Angeles and elsewhere, for that matter. And so we marched from the Chancery on 9th Street on New Year's Eve, 1969, to St. Basil's Church. And we picketed in front of that church when the cardinal at the time, McIntyre, was saying his midnight mass on New Year's Eve. In 1984, 1985 is my second case. It was a case to save Cathedral High School, right? That's the high school I went to. So a little background. This is Cathedral High School here in downtown, just east of downtown Los Angeles. It's the second oldest Catholic high school in Southern California, behind Loyola High School. But unlike Loyola, Cathedral has always served the poor and immigrant communities. When I was there, before I got there, and to this day, that's what it's known for, to serve these communities. This is the Legion Park here in the foreground, and this is LA Chinatown. Cathedral High School used to be the original Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery. And so it was closed down, and they moved that cemetery over to where Calvary is now on Eastern and Whittier Boulevard in East Los Angeles. But this is what this high school sits on an old cemetery. But here's the story. The Archdiocese in 1984, without telling anyone, including alumni, current students, and I suppose they contacted the Christian Brothers who taught at the school. They were selling the Cathedral High School, right? A school that historically had served poor and immigrant communities. A Hong Kong developer had bought the school and was in escrow. And then we found out about it as alumni, and we challenged our church. So this is 14 years after the Católicos por la Raza demonstrations. We challenged our church around the sale of Cathedral High School. And so we had a campaign, on the bottom is our bumper stickers that we handed out in different venues. We had billboards all over the city telling people to support us, to contact us as we challenged the church in the closure of our school, this particular school. One of the tactics that we had, similar to the tactic of the Católicos, is that we would follow the then Archbishop or Cardinal of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, Cardinal Manning. And wherever he would say church on Sunday morning, we would pick at the church. We would leaflet the church, and we would ask the parishioners to support us in keeping open the school. As you can see here, this is Cardinal Manning. This is one of the signs that we used. And we got relatively good sort of feedback or response from the parishioners at each of the churches that he said Mass. We had people on the inside who would tell us where he'd be saying Mass on the next Sunday. So we would follow him from church to church as he made his way through Southern California on any given Sunday. But in 1985, Roger Mahoney, who had been the Archbishop of Stockton, we had heard that he was now going to be the Archbishop of the LA of Los Angeles. And so even before he came down to Los Angeles, a group went up to meet him in Stockton and told him about our issues, what he was getting himself into, and we asked him to think about rescinding the sale of Cathedral High School. And he basically, after 18 months, the controversy lasted 18 months, but Roger Mahoney basically rescinded the sale, and Cathedral remains open to this day. And so those are two examples of how I challenged my church, but I was trained to challenge institutions. And I would argue I was trained to challenge my church when I felt they were wrong. And in this particular case, me and my colleagues and other activists, whether it was Católicos por la Raza or the Save Cathedral High School, we did just that. Case 3 has to do with Catholic church documents. And so in all of these sort of, even to this day, I'm constantly looking to see how my church is responding to questions around race and racism to this day. And so here's a letter that I would like you to if, at some point, if you could find. It's called the U.S. Catholic Bishop's Pastoral Letter on Racism. It's called Brothers and Sisters to Us. It was originally published in 1979, and then 25 years later, in 2004, it was republished with an addendum. But again, this was basically the U.S. Catholic bishops dealing with questions around racism in the church. And in the very first line of this letter, this is what they said. They said, racism is an evil which endures in our society and in our church. And when I first read that, I was stunned that they had basically recognized that racism exists within the church, within the Catholic Church. And a couple of paragraphs down, it said racism is a sin. It was very clear that this is what they were arguing in this particular pastoral letter. And again, I would recommend that you take a look at this, read this. This is part of, I would argue, this is part of critical race theory in the way in which we document institutional racism in institutions like the church. And this is at least one of them. In 1988, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, this coming out of Rome, put together a text called The Church and Racism Toward a More Fraternal Society. And again, I would ask you to take a look at this, this document. The original text was in 1988, and it was updated in 2001. And then finally, the last document came out 2 years ago, again from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. It says, "Open wide our hearts, the enduring call to love, a pastoral letter against racism." So once again, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is trying to deal with these issues around race and racism that exist within the church and within all the institutions within the church, which includes their schools. So the conclusion of this counter story, and I have to remind you it was an abridged counter story, is that I would argue that the Christian churches, more specifically the Catholic Church, should acknowledge, should atone, and should take action for their racist sins, past and present. I would say the Brown Church, Professor Chao Romero's book, provides an intellectual and theological map to guide us in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will next be joined by Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black.
Thank you so much.
And as a reminder, if folks have questions, I do encourage you to place them in the Q&A, which is on the bottom of your screen.
So thank you so much for the invitation to be here today at this event, sponsored by the Chicano Studies Research Center. This great book talk on Professor Robert Chao Romero's Brown Church. I'm a professor of art history and Chicano studies here at UCLA. I think of myself as a border crossing art historian, and it's my experience in these two fields that these experiences inform my thoughts today. So shout out to Las Cafeteras also. So I'm going to begin today talking about what I really appreciate about this book, and then end with a question for Professor Romero and for all of us to consider and think about today. This is a field-changing book. I think it's going to be a hallmark for decades to come. It's important, innovative, and it's unusual in how deeply interdisciplinary it is. And it's deeply creative, too. Professor Romero's creating a field of study that brings together Chicanic studies, history, theology, and critical race studies for the first time. So I was just so impressed by how utterly original the book is. So there's a great deal that I appreciate about the book. I'm going to focus briefly on 5 contributions, but the book is also personally very meaningful to me as someone whose research has focused for many years on sacred imagery in the early modern colonial era and its afterlife in contemporary Chicanic art. And as someone who, when I was interviewed at UCLA 20 years ago, was explicitly grilled by the Search Committee in Art History about whether I was religious or not. And when I evaded the question, I was asked, quote, "Are you a practicing Catholic, yes or no?" And I've actually written a little bit about that experience and others. This recent volume, I wrote an essay in this recent volume edited by scholar Luisa Del Giudice, on second thought, women scholars reflect on profession, community, and purpose. I'd like to turn now, though, to Professor Romero's 5 major contributions in this book, the things that I appreciated the most. The first was how student-centered it is. The way his students inspired his research. It begins with those student voices and it ends with those student voices. The second thing is its important contributions to this enormous gap in scholarship around religion and Chicanic studies. And speaking personally, as someone trained as an art historian, for example, there's been very little work done on sacred imagery in Chicanic art. What I call the pictorial language of Catholicism in an early article that I wrote back in 1999. And I'll just show you, it's clear by looking at any selection of Chicanic art works that the language of Catholicism is actually very important in that visual tradition. I'm showing you Esther Hernandez, Judith Hernandez, Asco, and David Avalos, or could take a look at yard shrines to the Virgin of Guadalupe. or, for example, the shrine at the Mercadito. And I think of all the things that we aren't studying because of this unwillingness to engage with religion. I do want to point out that the gap was addressed by Laura Perez in this 2007 book, really important book, but there's still so much work left to do. And I was thinking of my recent work on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, how understanding of her most important portrait from the colonial era, which is the Miguel Cabrera, it's posthumous, on the left, how knowledge or understanding of that had been hampered by a lack of knowledge about Catholicism. And it was an interpretive strategy that I then extended to contemporary Chicana artists' renditions to understand how Chicana artists had radically transformed Sor Juana into an icon of liberation for women. And it's very different from what happened in Mexico. So I sincerely hope that the Brown Church will inspire more research on religion in Chicanic studies, in history, and in art. The absence in the scholarship is just glaring. And then the third point I wanted to mention was Professor Romero's theorizing of Brown and Brown Church. This is such an important and inspiring contribution, building on Chicana feminist theorizing of Nepantla. And then number 4, his ecumenical approach to religion, including his fearless defense of the Virgen de Guadalupe. His interpretation of the Virgen is absolutely new, and there's nothing like it. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I want you to read it in his book. And this is a hard thing to do in this enormous field of studies, Guadalupean studies. It's a new reading, a new understanding of her, rooted in his interdisciplinary approach and his faith. It's a very moving interpretation of her. And then finally, number 5, Professor Romero's framing of the history of Christianity to recognize and recover a decolonizing church with a history of social justice dating back to European contact. And this for me has been the most important takeaway, because I've been struggling with what scholar Nelson Maldonado Torres has called the metaphysical catastrophe of the Renaissance. And this is from one of his essays that's in this Relational Undercurrents exhibition catalog. So this period of European exploration, invasion, and conversion in the Americas and around the world, he describes as an era of metaphysical catastrophe. So while Europeans thought of this as this great cultural flowering, the colonized perceived life as, quote, a permanent struggle against death. And think about the demographic catastrophes, the enslavement of humans that occurred at this time. This is also the moment, according to Nelson Maldonado Torres, when the idea that the other was less than human emerged. So I think a lot about how the Catholic Church was complicit in that othering, in that view that made us less than human. So I've been really trying very hard to think through the position of the Catholic Church in this history. And I've been thinking about what indigenous voices tell us about this history, and in particular, about the history of California's missions. And this is inspired by our current grant, Critical Mission Studies, through the Office of the President. Here's a picture of us. And thinking deeply about the toppling of monuments to the Catholic Church, such as all those Father Sarah statues that came down this summer, along with the Confederate statues, as well as the fire at the San Gabriel Mission. So this is the statue that came down June 20th at Olvera Street. So Professor Romero's new book, Brown Church, has helped me to think through these really complicated issues in a more nuanced way, and I look forward to presenting his arguments in my upcoming fall class. So my final question for him, for all of us, I think maybe to think about, would be to ask if he might comment on the recent controversies over the California missions. What can Brown Church, 5 centuries of Latina, Latino social justice, theology, and identity contribute to these current controversies over missions in California, New Mexico, elsewhere, and discussion of conversion? So thank you so much to everyone for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to read your book and to have a chance to comment, and congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments and slideshow. Professor Chao Romero will now have time to respond to the panelists' comments. During this time, again, I encourage you to add your questions to the Q&A box for our conversation, which is to follow. And again, that hashtag is Brown Church, and there will be a raffle for free copies of the book for those who tag at UCLA_CSRC. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Professor Romero.
First, thank you so much, Marisol and Dr. Solórzano, Dr. Villaseñor Black, for your very gracious comments. It really means so much. To respond to kind of some of the themes that Marisol presented, first, con el favor de Dios, right? That expression, I think that's what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about like sort of the spiritual capital, right? The community cultural wealth. And that's, you know, it's one little piece, but I think of, for example, like all the dichos, right? And you know, like how those, I mean, that's a whole, like you could do a whole kind of conversation about that, the spiritual wealth contained in the dichos, right? And I just, so I appreciated that as an example of that. Also, in terms of the negative association between Christianity, Western Christianity, and justice. First, I want to underscore as clearly as possible that I get that. Oh man, like, you know, I like to joke and say, okay, probably if you look at Christian history over the last 500 years, probably 85% of it has been really bad, horrible, the worst you can think of. But I'm talking about the 15%, talking about the 15% to reclaim that. And even that 15% is not perfect. And in the book, I try to present the humanity of the different characters as well, right? Their strengths as well as their weaknesses. So for example, like in the book, I talk about, you know, Cesar Chavez, right? And sort of the way in the first decade, especially of his movement, how it was very, in my view, very brown church. So he said things like, you know, the only justice is Christ, right? And, you know, he talked about how, you know, he framed his fasting very much in spiritual terms and, you know, loving your enemy and nonviolent social resistance in the tradition of Jesus and the early church and things like that. His pilgrimage, or, you know, the famous march, right, to Sacramento was a pilgrimage, right? A spiritual pilgrimage that was celebrated, that culminated on Easter morning with the celebration of Mass using an altar off of a farm worker pickup truck, right? So those are beautiful things like the brown church. I try to talk about his humanity as well, though, and how, like, in my view, he became quite narcissistic and kind of took his eyes off of, in my view, kind of some of that original focus. And, you know, so with all the characters here, I'm not trying to do, like, in other words, just like a totally romantic kind of presentation. Although I'm assuming I might get some of that critique, and that's okay. Because like the work is historical, but it's also identity formation as well. So it's sort of, there's a tension there. And so I wanted to clarify that. And one more thing I'll say is that this whole project of Brown Church is it's decolonizing, right? Explicitly decolonizing, right? Whether it's decolonizing Jesus, whether it's decolonizing the church, as an example of sort of decolonizing Christology, right, or the study of Jesus. Latino theologians talk about Galilee, right? And they say, why does the Bible always talk about that Jesus was from Galilee, right? Galilee, and that Jesus lived most of his life in Galilee and did most of his ministry in Galilee, and according to Christian belief, resurrected and then told his disciples, meet me in Galilee, right? Why all this Galilee, right? And what scholars like Virgilio Elizondo, Orlando Costas have said is that Galilee was the hood. Galilee was the hood of the day, right? It was a marginalized borderlands region where people were bilingual. They spoke with an accent. They were looked down upon. If Galilee was today, it would be Boyle Heights, where I was born, right? It would be San Bernardino. It would be pick your hood. That's what Galilee was, right? And so we've reframed, for example, that's an example of sort of the decolonization and reframing. And there's many more other examples, but I want to be very explicit and clear about that. I'll share another fun example because I think it's along those lines. we often hear the words good news, right? The good news. And it's lost its meaning, but that was actually very subversive for Jesus and the early disciples to say good news, because the language of good news was reserved for Caesar, for Rome. So they'd say, good news, a new emperor is born. The new emperor is the new savior of the world. The new emperor is son of God. The new emperor is all these things, and he will bring this era of peace, right? And so you can see where I'm going with this, right? So when Jesus and the early disciples would say, good news, right? There is a son of God, savior of the world, who have come to make all things new. You can see how subversive that was. But those are examples of sort of kind of decolonizing those traditional Western frameworks. Thank you so much, Dr. Solórzano, for sharing personally. Oh my gosh, like I just want to like interview you and hear your, hear your stories, and it's been fun. Like we've run into each other like at different like concerts and kind of different places, and I got to hear bits and pieces of some of your religious counter story. So thank you. That meant so much to hear. And Dr. Solórzano really has lived the brown church, right? Maybe that's what I'll say. Lived the brown church. So Católicos por la Raza just celebrated like that 50th anniversary of storming St. Basil's, right? Amazing. That's like this moment in Chicano history that is so overlooked, right? And there's great new scholarship about that from different colegas, and the story of Cathedral High. I remember, seeing those bumper stickers, Safe Cathedral High, and then now I know, oh, that was you. Amen. That's so powerful, and the idea of like picketing, following the bishop wherever he went to preach, that is so gangster. That is so awesome, right? And then talking. Like that's also an example of this, to me, of this community cultural wealth and the brown church as organizing tools, and with so much possibility, like amazing. And the different Catholic Church documents that you mentioned, the pastoral letter on racism, and the explicit framing of racism as sin. That's powerful. Like just that, racism as sin. I just want to chew on that for such a long time, and like, because I'm not sure, like in our ethnic studies, we can say racism is bad, or racism it gives power in certain people's hands, but to say that racism is sin, that's just very powerful. It's just very, very much to chew on there. And the preferential option for the poor, so beautiful. And of course, like for those who might not be familiar with that concept, as Dr. Solórzano said, it's the idea that in this world that is broken and fallen and everything like that, and racist and all these things, the poor get the short end of the stick. So when God sees the poor suffer, or sees mujeres suffer, or sees anybody suffer, God takes their side. That's the preferential option for the poor. Like it's like if you have different children, like I have 2 kids. If one of my kids is beating up the other kid, which actually frequently happens, but if that was like, that's happening, and one of my kids is suffering, I love both my kids, but I got to intervene on behalf of the kid that is my child that is suffering, right? And take their side. Latino theologians have framed uniquely, like, so of course you have Gustavo Gutierrez, who first kind of framed that term in Peru, in a Latin American context. And then you have, in the US context, Virgilio Elizondo framed it as the Galilee principle. Those that human beings reject, God calls God's very own. Those that human beings reject, God calls God's very own. It's like so much wisdom and just power and inspiration there. So thank you so much, Dr. Solórzano, and I look forward to having more conversation. And thank you also, Dr. Villaseñor Black. It is great I'm just so floored and just really humbled by what you shared. Thank you. And I just love looking at all of this from the angle of art history and sacred imagery in Chicanx art. Wow, there's just so much there. And the yard shrines and others, other artwork of La Virgen, work of Laura Perez and Alma Lopez, Miguel Cabrera that you cited. There's so much that I need to learn, And I really appreciate the fact of how you mentioned that, like, the image of La Virgen has been reclaimed in such a powerful way by Chicanx scholars, Chicana scholars, whereas, you know, biblically speaking, I'm just going to say it bluntly, like, Jesus's mom was just like, actually, I'm not going to say it. I can't even say it. Jesus's mom was so tough, and you don't mess with her, right? It says, like, you know, in the Magnificat, you know, she talks about, like, throwing rulers down from their thrones and, like, giving all their possessions and everything to the poor. Like, she's fierce, right? And I think that Chicana artists have recaptured that spirit. Whereas in, like, say, in Mexico, like, instead of taking, you know, the powerful story of experience of La Virgen and Juan Diego as an empowering thing, boy, in Latin America, La Virgen has been just so domesticated in a way that is just so far from what the biblical texts reveal about her. And yeah, the metaphysical catastrophe of Renaissance. Wow. Yeah, it's so tragic, so sad, so horrible. Like, there can be no apologetics made for that. It was just so bad. Christianity taken and just decimating through colonization. One of the interesting things that I reflected upon in the book was tracing, like, some of the genealogy of, like, this othering of non-white bodies, and how from the very first days of the Spanish conquest, so interesting to see them. So interesting to see how from those very earliest days, some Spanish theologians cited from Aristotle, and they cited his teachings on natural slavery. And they took those teachings of natural slavery and kind of, like, mixed them with Christian theology to say that, well, anyone with brown skin is a natural slave, right? And of course, you had people like Las Casas and Montesinos and others that would fiercely challenge that. But it's just like the genealogy of it is very fascinating. And then, boy, like, the importance of indigenous voices in the brown church. I tried to point out some indigenous voices in the book, not enough, but for example, I could talk about Juan Poma de Ayala, this indigenous noble from Peru, who wrote this incredible, like, I don't know how many thousands of pages it is. It's like this book that, like, again, it's written like in the 1600s or something, fusing theology, fusing, like, sciences, fusing law, fusing all these things to basically say, Spaniards, you've got this whole Christianity thing wrong, right? We get Jesus is great, but you're messing it up, right? It's amazing, right? And I tried to point out in the book sort of these diversity of voices. There's so many more that I could have shared, but I tried to share, you know, mestizo, indigenous, and other voices. If I had more space, I would have shared Asian, Latino voices and so forth, but alas, you know, I have those limits. And then, boy, the question of the California missions and the brown church, whew, that is just, like, I just have to say, like, that there is no biblical grounds for forced conversion. That's not Jesus, right? And I know that Las Casas spoke about that, and he talked about how, as many of the listeners will know, part of the debate, there was something called the Great Debate during the colonial period, where, like, Las Casas and others were saying, you can't just, like, go to war with people in order to convert them. That's just so wrong, right? Was the gospel brought to Spain that way, right? And you have this great big debate in Spanish society, and then others like Sepulveda saying, well, of course you can. You can go to war and force conversion. And I think, like, that's the root of it. Like, can you force someone to believe? And the answer is, like, heck no. Like, that's not. I think the message from the brown church would be no. And anyone, no matter how they try to spin it, that's not okay, right? Some people think that Las Casas had that perspective of of conversion through love and nonviolence because of his potential Jewish heritage, that he might have had some. That's an interesting speculation. So, wow, I can't believe I'm saying all this at a UCLA event, but thank you all. Thank you so much. I'm just so grateful. Thank you, Charlene, Danny, Marisol, if I might be so informal, and Jenna, and hopefully we have a few moments to be able to share or talk, or I'm not sure, but thanks for listening to all that.
Thank you for that. I am, just so folks know, I'm temporarily disabling the chat while we work through some technical difficulties that we're encountering. But we hope to get that running again soon. But you can still submit through the Q&A option on the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. So there have been some really great questions posed in the Q&A, and I also saw earlier in the chat, I've been trying to keep track of some of those. So I'm going to start with a question, and I think there were themes that repeated across a few different questions that I saw. And I believe Professor Romero has touched on it a bit, but this could be an opportunity to talk about it a little bit in more detail. So the question I'll go ahead and start with is, how do you see the quote popular spiritual movements throughout Latino America that are outside of specific churches or traditional Christianity, many based in indigenous or African traditions such as Danza de Concheros or Santeria, to name just two, in relation to the Brown Church? Do you see sharp distinction between these traditions in the Brown Church? Or is there a common thread of community and spiritual capital and resistance and resilience in these traditions? So many of these practices are syncretic and weave their way in and out of Christianity, and faith and gratitude permeate these practices as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think that what it makes me think of is my friend Oscar Garcia Johnson's book. So Oscar Garcia Johnson is a good friend. He's a professor, the director of the Centro Latino at Fuller Seminary. And he recently wrote a book called Spirit Outside the Gate, Spirit Outside the Gate. And he talks about these themes of the Spirit of God. Like a lot of times Europeans made it seem as if, okay, we came on the Nina, the Pinto, the Santa Maria and brought you God, right? And his book is saying, no, God was already there, right? The Spirit of God was working outside of the gates of many of our formalized institutions, right? Even today, right? Especially back then, right? And so I think that and many people might use the term syncretism in a very pejorative way to say non-Western, right? But the way that I view personally now, from a theological perspective, is that the gospel message makes its way into a particular culture and goes native. That's what Latino theologians say. They say that the Holy Spirit likes to go native. And the way that I view culture is that, again, sort of from a theological perspective, is that every ethnic group has glory and honor. Revelation 21:26 says that the different ethnic groups of the world have glory and honor. They have community cultural wealth. And then the next verse 27 says, it infers at the same time, every ethnic group has stuff that's not good, right? So Latino culture, we have machismo. That's not good, right? But we have lots of glory and honor, right? And in the academy, in society, typically what's been said is only white people have glory and honor. Only European cultures have glory and honor. And I think that the Spirit goes native, right? The glory and honor, it transcends, our formal kind of institutions. I will say that's many times, actually, I think I'll just stop there. I think that, to be able to get to some other questions, but I think that it's not it's all of that and more.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to another question that, again, I felt like had parallels across multiple questions. And that is, I love that you specifically include Black as an important aspect of Latinx identity. As an Afro-Latino, I always feel like I have to explain my existence within the Latinx community. How can the brown church push other Latinx folks to be more inclusive of the Afro-Latinx experience and understand it as an important aspect of Latinidad and not as a lesser aspect?
Yeah, amen. It's like, it's a core, beautiful aspect of it. So, I mean, like in Mexico, for example, there's this tremendous, beautiful, rich Afro-Mexicano heritage there that's hundreds of years old. People of African descent outnumbered Spaniards in Mexico until like the 1800s. And it's like, but there's that sort of, again, like the brown racism that is it's a hangover, it's horrible, evil hangover of the sistema de castas, right? Sistema, the caste system in Latin America that existed for several hundred years, that made an idol of Europeanness and so-called Spanishness, and then, you know, put everybody else below. And within our Latino cultures, I think that's the core of it, is like, there's just these artificial racial categories that we have that so many people still cling to. So for example, I remember like walking in my neighborhood, I do a lot of walks, and I met this neighbor. Within 10 seconds, like, they were Peruvian, right? Within 10 seconds, the wife's like, my husband's Italian. Like, what? I don't care, right? Why do you have to tell me in the first 10 seconds that your husband is Italian, even though you're both from Peru? And that's the same thing. It's the hangover from the Sistema de Castas, right? And that leads so many of us to deny, you know, our beautiful mixture, you know, that we have as a Latino people. And I'm just so angry that our Afro-Latinidad gets shoved under the rug or denied or made any less. That's horrible. It's such an essential part to our glory and honor.
Thank you. Moving on from there, we had two different questions about Sor Juana. There was a lot of interest around that chapter in your discussion of it. The first asked about, you use Sor Juana as the first feminist theologian of the Brown Church, and thinking about your concept of spiritual borderlands. And they asked, can you speak to Sor Juana as a symbol of both gender and sexual liberation? How can sexual difference also fit into the teaching of the Brown Church?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So what I did in my reading of Sor Juana was to read her as a sister. Take her writings at face value, right? And say, okay, she claims to be a Christian, she claims to be a Roman Catholic, and then let's talk about how she discusses gender and theology. And I know that there have been many other very valuable interpretations of her, right? You know, Sor Juana, and issues of sexuality, and as a symbol of sort of, you know, Chicana lesbian feminism and so forth, which are, you know, valid interpretations. I would say that in terms of the Brown Church, there is queer theology that exists that people don't know about, that if people would like to, and there's mujerista theology, and there's Latina evangelica theology. There is this vast trove of theology that people can read and explore. And so I would direct my colleagues or the person who asked that question to that vast community cultural wealth that is present in those theologies and literatures. And that I need so much more to learn about as well.
So openings for connection there. So the next question is one that I think touches on one of your case studies. And it's concerned with more of our current moment, historic in its own sense. And if you could speak to that we have the precedence right now that many Latinx churches are often drawn to conservative political values that would denounce the contributions of the, quote, Brown Church. And they give the example of El Salvador, where at the end of the Civil War and the assassination of Monsignor Romero, many then turned against liberation theology and against any explicit discussion of what they label as politics rather than social justice. So if you can speak to that. Sure,
absolutely. And I've had the privilege of talking to friends who are in Latin America, pastors, theologians, that, you know, have talked to this about, and just experience. I go to a local Latino church in Pasadena, right, with immigrants, and it's just like when I grew up and everything. So I'm kind of live my spiritual life at that ground floor level. And I would say that it's really unfortunate that so many Latino churches are whitewashed. That's just it. That's the reality, right? But sadly, it's not new. There's always been this tension between this church of the status quo in Latin America and the brown church. It's 500 years old, so it's nothing new. In the United States, same thing, right? And so, I mean, it's so deeply troubling to me that there's so many Latino churches that still support Trump, right? In the face of so much injustice, counter to biblical values of, loving your neighbor, loving immigrants and the poor. At the same time, though, and maybe, and this is where I hope the brown church can sort of open up not only the history, but also the present reality of it. I'm a community organizer in the brown church, right? I've been arrested twice, right? I have friends, like, they kill themselves day and night as the brown church in organizing around issues of justice and gender and immigration. So I think that, like, well, though that is true, that's kind of the point of the book, that there is this brown church that is there, and unfortunately, it's not always visible, but it's there. Something that I'll say too is I know we're kind of out of time, but there was a theology in Latin America. It's a Protestant, basically, expression of liberation theology, and it's called Misión Integral. Misión Integral. Misión Integral. They said that the gospel is like a plane with two wings. One wing is personal transformation. The other wing is social transformation. One wing is the verbal proclamation of the good news. The other wing is the embodiment of that good news in justice and mercy and compassion and so forth, right? And they said, if you're missing one wing or the other, no sirve. The plane doesn't fly, right? And that's kind of like in Latin America, and I'll close with this story. I was talking to Ruth Padilla de Borst, who is this amazing theologian. Her dad is Rene Padilla, who is like the founder of Misión Integral in Latin America. And a lot of people now say, oh, Misión Integral is like, that's like old school. We don't do that anymore, right? The two wings thing is old school. And to summarize her in my own words, it's not that Misión Integral has been tried and found to be untrue. It's been tried and found to be too hard. It's so much easier to do one wing or the other, and really hard to do both.
Thank you for that. I know we are at time, so I want to ask just one more question that is a short one, which is if you can speak more to the poem that you read early on. It struck a lot of people. I will say that folks can find a copy inside the book, but there was the question of are there other places where folks can gain access to it? And also, if you could speak to the poem as a way of making voices heard.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, the poem is in the book. You can also Google it. It probably shows up somewhere on my website for free. It's probably on YouTube somewhere as well. The poem is my articulation of a brown church identity. That's what it is, right? So, and again, if you're familiar with the I Am Joaquin poem from the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, I'm totally just using that as my inspiration here. And so I'm trying to say that all of these different figures that I cite from Latin America, from different countries, from US Latinos, they were all involved with the struggle for social justice, from colonization to Jim Crow segregation to all these things, fighting against that, but just in different moments in time. And I'm saying that as the Brown Church, we share all of that history together. And at the same time, like I talked about the two wings of the plane, God calls me mija, mijo, right? That's the first wing, right? And so I'm tying that all together and say, this is how did Marisol said earlier, this is a collective consciousness. This is a collective consciousness of 500 years. That's the poem.
Thank you so much. We do have a vibrant Q&A question queue going on. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I will share them with Professor Romero, and hopefully this is an ongoing conversation, and maybe those can serve as the basis for Brown Church Part 2, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your responses, for the panelists for sharing their insights, and to the CSRC and the Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies for sponsoring, and for everyone here for bringing their engagement and enthusiasm and questions. For those who are interested in watching the panel again, or maybe you joined in at different points, there will be a recorded version of the panel posted on the CSRC's YouTube page. I encourage you to subscribe to their channel, which has lots of great content, including all of the speakers, or many of the speakers who come through the center. I'd also like to announce that for anyone who was using the hashtag, we will be going through social media and putting the names in a hat and randomly pulling a few out. And I will be contacting you via that social media channel for your copy of Brown Church. So thank you for being here. We know people are tuning in from far and wide, and we wish everyone a great evening.
Bendiciones.
Congratulations, Professor Romero.
Thank you so much, Jenna, again, for organizing all this in such an amazing way. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone, Charlene, Danny, and Marisol.
Thank you, Robert.